Thanks, Becky, and thanks to CGCAS and AWARE, and thanks to all you guys for coming out. I gave a talk here about 7 or 8 years ago at Bob's invitation, and just as I was starting this project at Crystal River, so it's nice to come back when I have some data and something more concrete to talk about. I know from talking to a couple people before the meeting that a lot of you guys are already a little bit familiar with Crystal River already. It's because it's just up the road, and also because it's one of Florida's most famous archaeological sites, and all you guys are interested in archaeology to some extent, or else you wouldn't be here. But I'll give a little bit of an introduction to Crystal River for whoever might not be as familiar, and how it became famous, how it kind of faded from fame, and then the research that we've been doing lately. But first, I want to talk about why we should care about the village that existed 2,000 years ago, which I think is a reasonable question to ask, because of course today we live in an increasingly urbanized society. The United Nations says like 50% of the world's population lives in cities, and they project by 2050 that probably 2/3 of the world's population is going to live in cities. So cities kind of seem natural to us today, and we recognize that living in larger communities has some amenities. It also has some drawbacks, of course, but it's something that we kind of take for granted. But it's worth remembering that, like most of human history, people lived in much smaller communities. We know, of course, that our species has been around for about 200,000 years, and for most of that time, up until well, there's a graph under that graph, but most of that time, the population, up until about 10,000 BC, that population was probably under 1 million, well under 1 million. And people lived in very widely dispersed communities. This graph is fairly flat, and then the population, of course, took off about 200 years ago. And a lot of that corresponds with the transition to living in urban areas. But if you zoom in on that sort of hockey stick graph of world population from 10,000 BC to the present, it would look pretty flat. But if you zoom in, you would see at a finer scale a particular period in prehistory when population went up, and that was with the introduction of farming, when people started farming. And the graph on top here is a study comes from a study that was published a few years ago, where they compiled data from cemeteries that dated right about that time when people started farming in different areas in the world. And they mapped out the proportion of people, of young adults, which is kind of a proxy for population growth, because when you see population growth, you get a lot of young adults. And what they saw is if the 0 year here is that period when farming starts, and they've adjusted different sites for their time before or after that transition to agriculture. And you see a sharp increase in population right with agriculture. So we know that farming was a huge event in human history. So big that when archaeologists started studying this back in the 1920s, one archaeologist, famous archaeologist named V. Gordon Childe, coined the term Neolithic Revolution. Neolithic because it was assumed that where this transition took first in the Levant in the Middle East, that the transition to agriculture was associated with a new tool form, new stone tools, so Neolithic. But revolution, first because they assumed it happened really quickly, but also just because it was such a huge change. The transition to farming, the Neolithic Revolution, changed humanity forever. It's not a stretch to say that everything that we associate with urban life today, from cell phones to traffic jams, all stems back to this transition back in the Neolithic. And traditionally, archaeologists attributed most of those changes to farming. And the idea was that farming brought these population increases, or enabled these population increases that led to the first villages and to religion, and then within 1,000 or 2,000 years of that, to major cities, some of the world's first cities, and everything that went with cities like writing and social inequality and stuff like that. this was a tidy story. It made sense intuitively. We tend to favor economic or ecological explanations, and we tend to favor sort of innovations in human society. So the idea that farming precipitated these sort of changes made a lot of sense to archaeologists and to the general public. But in the 20 years, over the last 20 years, there have been a number of sort of significant finds that have really kind of upended this story. In the early 1980s, some archaeologists working in Israel uncovered a settlement called Hohol that dates to about 23,000 years ago. And they were able to document it's not a large settlement, but a settlement of a few huts where people were living permanently, well before farming. More substantively, we know that in Israel and Jordan, there were communities associated with what we call the Tufian culture, where they were building substantial houses and living in large communities, houses of stone, 14,000 years or so ago. So again, before that transition to farming. And, our ideas about why people started living in larger communities have also changed. One of the big discoveries has been the discovery of the Gobekli Tepe site in Turkey, where 11,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers came together and created this massive ceremonial ritual complex. These circular stone structures range from 10 to 30 feet in diameter. They have these massive stone pillars that have carvings of animals like lions and bears. And they've excavated about 4 of these, but the geophysical survey, GPR, indicate there are at least 16 more. So this really changed our thinking. This is religion before farming. Hunter-gatherers coming together and creating these big monuments was something that we didn't really even consider a possibility. So much so that some of you might have read a book by Charles Mann, 1492. He's written a couple other popular books. He described the discovery of Gobekli Tepe as like finding out that someone had built a 747 in their basement with an X-Acto knife. That might be a little bit of an exaggeration, but it really did change the way we thought about hunter-gatherers. So, the story about the Neolithic Revolution has changed. We can now say, that villages and religion really predate farming. And this, to me, makes the study of early villages important. And it situates it in this sort of larger question about why people cooperate. Why do people choose to cooperate? Which is a big topic in the social sciences, in the biological sciences. In fact, not too long ago, Science magazine described it as one of the big questions in the sciences in general. If you're curious sometime, Google evolution of cooperation and you'll see dozens, hundreds of scholarly articles on this topic. Cooperation is kind of a vexing issue for evolutionary scientists, for anthropologists, for biologists, for a couple reasons. It doesn't really make sense from an evolutionary standpoint. Most evolutionary scientists assume that people act in their own self-interest. And so the more mathematically minded of evolutionary scientists actually do a lot of kind of modeling of how people choose to cooperate. They especially play this game, it's called the prisoner's dilemma, and they have computers run these simulations and figure out why rational actors would choose to cooperate with each other. Mostly the models suggest that people don't choose to cooperate. Evolutionary psychologists study this a lot. They do it a little bit more sort of empirically, but they tend to focus, they'll do a lot of studies of like college students and ask them questions about cooperation. And of course, college students are probably not a great representative sample of humanity. So I think there's a real niche here for archaeology to tell real stories about the past and how and why people chose to cooperate, in particular in this case by living in larger communities. And so with my friend and colleague Victor Thompson, who's at the University of Georgia, we wrote a proposal to the National Science Foundation, and it took a while and back and forth, but we eventually got funding to study this problem from an archaeological vantage using the Crystal River site in Florida as a case study. So let me move on and talk about Crystal River. But I'm sure everybody who's from Florida knows about Crystal River, or the manatees up at Crystal River are a tourist attraction. The archaeological site, if you haven't been there, is just a couple miles north of downtown. It's a state archaeological park. It's a national historic landmark. It's well worth a visit. It was occupied primarily during the Woodland period, which goes from about 1000 BC to 1000 AD. So that's our period of study. In terms of location too, I would just point out, it's Crystal River, which is what the site is located on, is only about 10 miles long. It starts at Kings Bay, right in the downtown Crystal River, where a series of springs bubble up and where the manatees hang out when it gets cold. Crystal River is about halfway to the Gulf, downstream from that. In terms of why Crystal River is famous, or why it has been famous, there are two main reasons. One is that it's just one of Florida's largest mound complexes. It has a larger number of mounds and more diverse mounds than probably most of the sites in this state. It's got 3 platform mounds, 2 small, 1 large. It's got 2 burial complexes, one a discrete burial mound, one a sort of complex of several mounds. And it still has a extensive midden, a ridge of debris from people living on the site and depositing their trash over hundreds of years. The second, well, before I get to that, just a couple of views of the mounds. This is the main burial complex. It's actually reconstructed. Most of it was excavated, as I'll talk about in a second. This is Mound A, the larger of the mounds, of the platform mounds. And this is Mound H, one of the smaller platform mounds. Probably more than the mounds, though, Crystal River is famous as the southernmost major expression of what we call archaeologically the Hopewell interaction sphere, or the Hopewell exchange network. And I don't want to get into too much detail about this, but this was a kind of a ceremonial network, a religious network and trading network that really tied together communities across eastern North America. It was kind of centered in the Ohio Valley, and that's where a lot of the materials kind of radiated in and out of. But it really connected communities as far south as Florida, as far west as the Rocky Mountains, in this network of trade. So things like obsidian from the Rocky Mountains is found in Ohio. Mica from the southern Appalachians is found in Ohio. And we get, as I'm going to say in a second, things from Ohio and from the Appalachians that were flowing into Florida. So Crystal River is, as I'll show in a second, was a major player in this network for whatever reason. We see that because things like copper, which is of course not natural to Florida, is found at the Crystal River site. Some of this copper could have come from the Appalachians. Some of it could have come as far as the Great Lakes. Those are the 2 major sources of copper. Also things, exotic stones that are not found in Florida, especially quartz crystals, granites, hematites, things that must have come for hundreds, if not thousands of miles, flowed into this site at Crystal River. What did Crystal River exchange in return? We suspect that marine shell, especially the shells of gastropods, big lightning whelks, were carved into ornaments, and those are found into Ohio. So people at Crystal River and other sites on the Gulf Coast were trading these marine shells into the interior, where they show up in mounds in Ohio and even further north than that. What we know about Crystal River until recently has been associated with 2 individuals. The first was an antiquarian, I hesitate to call him an archaeologist, by the name of C.B. Moore. Moore was a wealthy physician who lived most of the year in Philadelphia, but he would come down to St. Petersburg in the winter, and he had a steamship called the Gopher, which he would sail along the coast, up the rivers, and go to burial mounds and dig up burial mounds when he found them and could get permission to do it. Moore was quite enamored with Crystal River. I think it's the only site that he returned to 3 times. he only, I mean, over the course of those 3 visits, he was only there for probably a total of 2 or 3 weeks. But in those 2 or 3 weeks, he excavated, by one archaeologist's count, at least 400 burials, which is something like 20 burials a day. So he was basically just ripping out the burials to get the good stuff, basically. He did, though, you know, at Crystal River and other sites in the region, he did draw maps of the sites. He did publish accounts of his work. They're not the most detailed by modern standards, but he still recorded, you know, some of the details about his excavations. So in a lot of cases, those mound sites disappeared owing to development. Not the case with Crystal River, fortunately, but in a lot of cases, Moore's records are the only one we have. So we have kind of a love-hate relationship with Moore in a lot of ways. The other archaeologist was a guy named Raymond Bolin, who worked at Crystal River in the 1950s. And by this point, archaeology had advanced as a science, but Bolin was not always the best practitioner. It's kind of ironic he's shown here taking notes, because I don't think he took any notes, really. I don't know if they just for show. We don't really have any notes from Bolin's excavations. In fact, I think Moore's excavations are probably better documented. But Bolin also drew some maps of the site. He recorded some features, some additional mounds that Moore had not noticed. So we owe Bolin a debt of gratitude there. But we owe Bolin a bigger debt of gratitude because he was one of the major forces for getting the site protected and preserved. By the late 1950s, 1960s, Crystal River, like a lot of Florida cities, was starting to take off. You can see this in aerial photographs. Look at the one from 1952 on the top. There's very little development. 17 years later, you can see the development that happened around Crystal River. And Bolin, almost single-handedly, with some help from private landowners, was able to get the state to acquire Crystal River just in time, probably, to save it from being completely destroyed. He was not fast enough to get it from getting partially developed. A trailer park was built on part of the site right next to the big mound, and in fact, probably about half of the big mound was taken away and used as fill. So it's unfortunate. This happened all over Florida. Mounds, shell mounds in particular, were valued for use in fill, to fill in low spots, to build roads. And it's a story that was repeated all across the state, unfortunately. Good news, bad news. In 1993, the storm of the century flooded the entire Crystal River site. There was water in the museum up 2 feet high. It flooded out the trailer park. The state bought that last piece of property, removed the trailers, and today it has a much more natural feel to it. So that's an introduction to Crystal River. So now I'm going to transition and start talking about what we've been doing there. Like I said, we got an NSF grant to work at Crystal River. We spent 3 seasons there. We always take a picture on the steps of the mound. If you could zoom in on this, you'd probably see my hair getting thinner and grayer as the work progressed. Recognizing that this is an important site, but also a protected site, we tried to keep things kind of to take kind of a conservation ethic to Crystal River. And fortunately, archaeological methods have advanced to the point where we were able to get more information with less digging. And part of that is using some advanced technologies like ground penetrating radar, gradiometer, things like that can give you an image, not always a perfect image, but give you an image of stuff that's buried below the ground. So you don't have to dig as many holes to find what you're looking for, ideally. So that was my colleague running a GPR across the top of one of those mounds. GPR, we used it in the village too, but GPR was particularly useful in the mounds for seeing construction episodes. So for example, here you can see at the top a reflective layer that's in green. That's probably the capping layer of shell. Below that, a less reflective layer that's the sand that was used to build the upper stage of the mound. And then below that, again, more reflective layer of shell. So we could see some of the construction sequences in the mound from the GPR. But you still, I don't want to do archaeology when we don't dig holes in the ground anymore. We still need to dig holes in the ground. But we try to keep them fairly small. So this is Glenn Doran, recently retired from the Florida State University. This drilling setup. It's called the Geoprobe. And so we took, with Glenn's help, we took Geoprobe core samples from around the site. And the advantage of this, they're small cores, which is good for not disturbing the site, but they can also go very deep. So you can actually core from the tops of the mound all the way down to the base in some cases. So I don't know, we did about 30 of those cores. That just shows where they look like. Here's one of the cores on that same mound that we were doing the GPR on. You can see I'm retrieving the core sample, recording it, and we cut them open and we can see the stratigraphy, and you can kind of match up that stratigraphy, the soils that you see in the cores with the GPR and help you interpret it a little better. And of course we also get some artifact samples out of those that we can date. And then we did want to open up some larger areas, so we scattered some test units, test trenches around the site in the midden. This is to get larger samples of artifacts, to better date things, to see where people were living on the site. And we did 4 of these trenches. Here's one near one of the smaller mounds on the site. And what we see, you know, it just helps us interpret the site better, and we can, like I said, date those layers in the trenches. And of course, you know, there's an adage in archaeology that for every day in the field, you spend 2 or 3 days in the lab. I'm here to tell you, when you work on shell middens, it's more like 10 days in the lab for every day in the field. So we spent several years sorting through the materials from these test units, from the cores, because you know, you think of shell midden and you see the oyster shell and the other shellfish, but there's a lot of little stuff in there. John knows this too. There's all kinds of little fish bones and stuff that take a long time to sort through. So a lot of lab work, and part of that, one thing I would emphasize that we did here was a lot of dating. So before we started at Crystal River, I think there were about 5 radiocarbon dates, and we did about 60, I think, from Crystal River. So I like to think that it went from being one of the most poorly dated major sites in Florida to one of the best dated. I can't think of any more sites that have more radiocarbon dates. And that allows us to talk about the way this village grew up in fairly fine detail. All right, so what do we find out? I'm going to organize this around 4 main points that we discovered about the early village at Crystal River. So let's start at the start. The first major revelation was that Crystal River began as a vacant ceremonial center. What we mean by that is that it started as a ceremonial center where people did not live permanently. Radiocarbon dates suggest that the burial mounds were started well before the village actually began. At least a couple hundred years before, maybe as much as 1,000 years before. There was a little problem with dating. These dates are on human bone, and there could be a little problem there. There's a marine effect to the carbon, especially if people are eating a lot of fish that can make the dates appear older than they might be in truth. But we've dated enough now that I'm pretty confident that the site did start as a ceremonial center rather than a village. And there are other reasons to think this too. The main burial complex consists of a ring, a ring-shaped mound with a burial mound in the center. There are also burials in the ring. That sort of form is similar to mounds from this time period in the Ohio River Valley too, what we refer to as the Adena. And there are some additional examples too from Florida. So the question then, if this is a vacant ceremonial center, who is coming here for these ceremonies, and why? So the first question is a little easier to answer. We know, even though the area hasn't been completely surveyed archaeologically for sites, we know that sites from this time period, what we call Deptford, are fairly common on all the little marsh islands and into the interior. And they're small settlements, probably single families. So it's not too much of a leap to suggest that Crystal River was a religious center for these kind of dispersed family groups that lived across the landscape surrounding Crystal River. The second part, why, is a little tougher to answer. Archaeologists a lot of times think about burial mounds as being territorial markers. What better way to mark your territory than to have your ancestors buried there? It's a little hard to extend that to Crystal River because the burial mounds were set away from the river. They don't look like they were meant to be like prominent landscape features. And I also don't think the population density at this point was so great that there was necessarily that much conflict where people had to stake out resources. But I would suggest the possibility that the landscape had filled in enough to the point that people might have been starting to come into conflict once in a while about access to particularly good fishing spots or shell fishing spots. And there's good anthropological research to indicate that ritual can help us kind of mitigate some of those conflicts. People come together for these ceremonies, they have big feasts, big parties, and they work out those differences. And it also kind of supports the development of positions of leadership, whether you want to call them big men or big women or chiefs. Somebody has to be in charge of these ceremonies. And we see that at Crystal River in some of Moore's burials from the earliest levels of the burial mound. We see some kind of extravagant burials. I was just looking for the figures on this. One burial in particular that Moore dug was an adult. He was found lying with 3 copper pendants, 39 stone pendants, and the 2 parts of a lower jaw of a puma that had been kind of drilled together, probably to be worn on a mask or a costume, and 4 ground black bear teeth. Also notable, there was another burial that had these 4 quartz crystal pendants, a quartz amethyst pendant, kind of a beautiful purple color, and another batch of stone pendants, and a carved exotic stone that was carved in the shape of a bear canine. So these burials stand out. There's some others that stand out as being potentially some kind of leader, and particularly we would guess some kind of religious leader. As other people have pointed out, this is kind of common to that Hopewell network that I talked about before, where you get these burials with people that are buried with very exotic, kind of unusual items that is not hard to imagine were involved with sort of rituals. The quartz crystals, the copper, they all have kind of translucent qualities that suggest sort of things that might have evoked supernatural. The kind of animal imagery too, we know that shamans often assume when they go into trance-like states, they kind of assume those roles of animals too. So it's not too big of a leap to suggest that we're seeing some religious leaders kind of step into existence here in this early stage of Crystal River. So we think that this religious center formed the basis for this first initial period of village settlement, which starts about AD 125, we think. And our second major finding is that once the village starts, it takes a while to get going, it grows quickly in archaeological terms, but even I think in our own terms. In what we call the first phase of the village, you get this kind of C-shaped midden that formed. And I think it kind of references the burial mound. It's kind of pointed to the burial mound, and I think that was kind of the center for those first people that settled the site. You can see it's not easy to get down to this earliest occupation. The midden at Crystal River is about as tall as I am, so it takes some work to get down to there. And by the time you're at that depth, down this dark layer at the base of this trench, you're below the water table. So we had to kind of time the excavations for when low tide was, and do the best we could. Fortunately, our work here was rewarded in a sense when we discovered a string of post moles at the bottom of one of these trenches. It's not a complete pattern because we only opened up a limited area, but there's a semicircular arc of post molds that suggests like this village did include small houses, and there are houses from this period that have been excavated at other sites that looked fairly similar in terms of size and shape. So we think there were houses there. We think we have good evidence for that. We think they were scattered through the village, and the GPR kind of points that out. These are slices of the GPR data. At the top are some of the upper levels, and what you're seeing there is just the sheet midden of shell. But once you get down below it, you see kind of more discrete clusters of shell that might be consistent with sort of scattered houses at the earliest levels of the village. Now, we have some evidence from our excavations that we got some indications that maybe this first phase of village life was not permanent, that maybe people were just coming for seasonal, maybe in association with the ceremonies. And that was because the artifact density didn't seem very great compared to later levels. But we took advantage of a new technology where you can slice through an oyster, and oysters put on growth rings, sort of like trees do. And those growth rings vary based on the season and based on water temperature and things like that. So you can't just read the growth rings directly, but you can take isotopes of oxygen from those growth rings. And those oxygen isotopes that were laid down when the oyster was growing record the temperature of the water and the salinity. And you can tell where the oysters, or what season of the year the oysters were captured, whether it was warm season or cool season. We took these samples from different phases. The ones from phase 1 are only from cool seasons, cool months of the year. So we can say that this first village was probably just occupied during the winter. So it's kind of like cooperation was scaling up. People come for ceremonies, they start staying for a few months out of the year, and gradually, as we move into phase 2, we know from the oysters that they were staying there permanently. And during phase 2, the midden expanded, at least doubled in size, also got much thicker. So we expect, we kind of infer that the population probably grew substantially during this phase. And you can see that not only in the size of the midden, but also in the profile. See that this stratum 4 that says phase 2, really dark soil, full of artifacts, and you see features like post molds and stuff extending downward from that. A good indication that people were living more intensively, more permanently on site by this period. Why did the sudden population increase? Well, this period of growth at Crystal River corresponds with what we know geologically as the Roman warm period, and that's when sea levels went up. There was more precipitation. Sea levels went up. That probably wasn't a major factor at Crystal River itself, but that scattered population that was living on small marsh islands and low pieces of land, it might have become more of a hassle for them. Periodic flooding, high tides, and there's some geologic evidence that that wasn't a gradual increase in sea level, it was pulses. And there's evidence to the north of Crystal River that there was a major pulse around 8,200. So we suspect that some of those people that were living in surrounding areas probably came to live at Crystal River permanently during the second phase. And by this point, Crystal River was an important point in the landscape. People were already probably coming periodically for feasts and ceremonies. So it wasn't a big thing for them to come and start living at the site more permanently. Now we do know, surely there were some benefits to people coming and living. When you live in a village, you have a wider network of people to rely on. You can cooperate in subsistence, and we know from the subsistence remains in our test units that people were doing a lot of fishing of mullet, of catfish, occasionally catching dolphins, and a lot of these efforts require or would have benefited from having larger work groups, especially some of the fishing. If you can catching mullet, you do a lot better if you can string out some big nets and catch a lot of fish. So it was probably to people's advantage in certain respects to come together and live in this village. But we also know that there are a lot of hassles to living in village. For hunters and gatherers, who are used to having a lot of autonomy and used to controlling their own food if they're living in dispersed communities, there are obligations to share when you start living in villages. And there's just a lot more interpersonal conflict when people are, forced, or not forced, but starting to live with people they don't know as quite as well. So one of the third kind of insight that we think we've developed is that Crystal River was really in many ways made to integrate people together, to avoid those sort of conflicts, to mitigate those sort of conflicts, and to make it possible to live together. And The burial mounds are part of that. They continued to be built into this main period of occupation at Crystal River. In contrast with those fancy burials that we saw in the earlier levels, as we go further in time, it's harder to pick those burials out as being fancy. People were still buried with stuff, but we don't get the really elaborate burials. Moore noted this himself, that as he got into the upper levels of the mound, he saw fewer of those kind of fancy burials. So this is kind of a common thing on Neolithic societies in general. You know, how do you build this sense of community? Well, one way that people have done it in Neolithic communities in Europe and the Middle East is having these communal burials facilities where you put the remains of your ancestors, everybody's ancestors, together in a burial mound. It's a good sort of symbolic creation of the community. Another way that that they created this sense of community, though, was beyond burials. It's also big ceremonies. And so I'll draw your attention to the Plaza, which developed perhaps earlier, but became more formal during this phase when they built a mound, Mound H, on one end of the plaza. So we don't know what they were doing exactly with these platform mounds. You're probably familiar, some of you who know something about the archaeology of Florida know that in later periods, these were actually the substructures for chiefs' houses or temples. We don't have good evidence for that in this earlier period, in the Woodland period. We think instead that mostly these platform mounds were stages for rituals, and they would have been viewed by people who stood in the plaza below. So, you know, if you're standing in the plaza at Crystal River, you can pretty much see everything that was going on the platform mound above. And the plaza could have held easily the population of Crystal River and probably many more people from the surrounding area. So we imagine, you know, this is a place for communal festivals, for festivities, for feasts. We know from historic times that one of the big sort of festivals that took place on the plaza was the green corn ceremony. So when the first corn crops ripened in June, Native Americans in the Southeast would typically have a big party, the green corn ceremony. And part of that, there were several rituals that went into building community in the green corn ceremony. So part of it was the ceremonial lighting of a new fire. They would extinguish all the fires in the village, and the priest would light a new fire somewhere off the plaza or at the edge of the plaza. They'd bring it together in the plaza. Everyone would get a new fire from that fire, and they'd take that back to their houses. So it was like ceremonially saying we are all one fire, right? A second big part of the green corn ceremony was drinking a tea called black drink, made from yopon pollen, and it was often drunk out of these shell cups, whelk shell cups, as you can see in this engraving from the 1500s. So we don't know, you know, we can't say that the green corn ceremony was taking place at Crystal River at 300 or 400 AD, but there are indications that maybe something similar is going on. So, for example, Crystal River has produced dozens, maybe hundreds of these whelk shell cups that were used probably for ceremonial purposes. We've never tested them to see if it was it might be blackjack residue inside. But it wouldn't surprise me. There's a little bit of tantalizing evidence maybe for something along the lines of new fire taking place, or some activities taking place. In general, the plaza was apparently swept clean of debris. But if you look at the south part of the plaza, some of our cores produced more artifacts, particularly shell. And then we ran the gradiometer over that, and we had a big magnetic anomaly that would be consistent with possibly a fire or the remains of a fire being dumped there. I also had a student do some soil chemistry, and he found higher concentrations of phosphorus and some elements that might be associated with fire making in that part of the plaza. So there, you know, it's just kind of a hint, but there's kind of this tantalizing evidence that maybe something akin to the green corn ceremony could have been taking place at this really early date. So, you know, that whatever ceremonies were taking place at Crystal River through phase 2 really seemed to have held the community together well, because it persisted for several hundred years. But eventually, everything has to come to an end. And the end started at Crystal River somewhere in the 500s AD. Now, people often ask me when I'm talking about Crystal River, why did people abandon this place? Why did they move away? I prefer to frame it more positively, because by the AD 500s, people had been living at Crystal River for 500 years. If you count the time they were coming for burials, they had probably been coming to the site for 1,000 years. Compare that with our own society. The United States has only been around, 250 years or so. So this is a story of resilience. I mean, whatever they were doing at Crystal River, this early village really persisted a long time. But in the AD 500s, our evidence suggests that the village started to shrink to a small area north of the big mound. And, but it's not a tale of abandonment yet. They continue to come for ceremonies. They might have started this big mound earlier, but our dating suggests that they finished it during this phase. So people were still coming here. It was still an important point on the landscape where people congregated during times of the year. And there's some indications that maybe the flavor of life at Crystal River was starting to change. Mound A seems much different to me than the earlier mounds. It's built right on the water. It was obviously made to be seen. And it's tall enough, too, in comparison with the earlier platform mounds, that people couldn't necessarily see what was going on the top of the mound. There could have been a chief's residence or something that was sort of hidden from the commoner people that lived below. And then finally, by phase 4, the village continued to contract, and we suggest maybe the possibility that there was just a caretaker population that was left, either maybe just a chief and his family, or maybe just a priest and family. But anyway, by the time we get into the 800s or 900s, Crystal River finally is no longer occupied. And part of the story is that people start moving away from Crystal River in a climate interval that we call the Vandal minimum, where it got drier and cooler, more variable climate. They persisted, though, until, ironically, the climate got better, is when people completely abandoned the site during what we call the medieval warm period. And we think what was happening here is that as the climate got warmer and wetter, more precipitation, this is when we see the development of larger farming communities across parts of the southeast. And those new communities, different way of life, might have been an attraction for people from Crystal River that were drawn to these new centers that were emerging with what we call the Mississippian Period that started about 1000 AD. So Crystal River is abounded about this time that these larger communities start to form elsewhere in Florida and across the southeast. But, in conclusion, I just want to say that, again, it's this transition to village life that started at Crystal River that really sets up these larger communities and the transition to farming. The experiments that people started at Crystal River with living together in gradually in larger and larger communities and more permanent communities are what set the stage for the even larger communities that come to follow. So it's a story much like, I think, what took place in the Neolithic in areas like the Middle East, where those first villages precipitated larger villages and farming and all the things that come with it. So that's the new history of early village at Crystal River. And I thank you guys for entertaining my story, and I'll be glad to answer any questions you might have. Yes.
You said that Moore went there 3 times. Does anyone have an opinion do you think Moore was doing it for financial gain or just for his passion?
No, he was just generally really interested in, and I don't think I said this, but he excavated, anybody want to guess, a couple hundred, 500 maybe sites around the southeast. I mean, he went as far as along the Gulf Coast up into Louisiana. He went on the Atlantic coast too. So this was a lifelong passion for him, not something he did for a financial gain. I don't think he needed the money.
He's like a rich guy.
Yeah, he was very wealthy. So, yes.
What level of populations did the village sustain?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's also a very hard question to answer. You know, we're not talking a huge village. I mean, I think at its peak, the permanent resident population of Crystal River, I'm guessing was maybe in the 100 range, something along those lines. Now, I do think that swelled when they had a big ceremony, that you could have had multiple hundreds of people there, 200 or 300 or 400. But you do have to keep in mind, though, that sounds so small to us, right? But Crystal River with 100 people, for most of those, you know, people that lived in dispersed communities, it would have been like coming to Manhattan is for us, you know. The mounds were like skyscrapers, pretty much. And it would have seemed, I think, urban to people of that time period who lived in smaller communities. Yeah.
Why the delay on testing the conch shells?
Why the delay on testing?
You said you haven't tested those yet?
No. Well, you know, you can only do so much. It's not easy. Most of that stuff is at the Smithsonian, and I have seen a lot of it, but they're not. They would probably let us scrape some residue. They're not big on destructive analysis, but we could probably scrape some residue off of them. But the other question is, like, those were excavated 100 years ago. What's been done to them since? And we don't really know. So whether you get a good sample out of them would be another question. So, yeah. In the back?
Did you find any faunal remains?
Tons and tons of faunal remains. Tons and tons. Yeah, it's I mean, there's a lot of fish. But, you know, I didn't talk about the faunal remains, but aquatic resources, not surprisingly, are the major component. So,
how about plants?
I'll direct you to my grad student, Kendall Jackson, back here. We collected soil samples and we processed those. Kendall, though, looked at the pollen, and there is some tantalizing evidence for perhaps people using marsh plants. We don't get corn. There's no corn. We don't see much nutshell. I do suspect that they were gathering nutshell, but we do think that there could have been harvesting some of the marsh plants. There's some tubers that grow in marshes, Wapato, some other ones, cattails and stuff like that we see pollen evidence for that could have been used. But they don't leave much in terms of physical evidence in the midden, especially root crops. Yeah?
Find any canoes?
We did not find any canoes, no. No, it wouldn't surprise me if there are some buried there or in the surrounding area. But of course, the Weeden Island canoe is unusual. Yeah.
What are steel affiliates to finish all this?
What's that?
The steel, what do they fit?
Yeah, I didn't want to get into the steel because it's a whole other thing. One of the things that happened when Ripley Bolin was working at the site, you know, you have to keep in mind, if you go to Crystal River now, it's like open park. But when Moore and Bolin were there, it was really heavily overgrown. And so Bolin got a surprise when he was there in the late 60s. A stone, a slab of limestone was discovered, and it has a carving. Actually, I anticipated this might come up, so I think I don't know if we'll be able to see it. There it is. It's got a carving in it of what looks like it's a human face with flowing hair. And Bolin thought that that part was original. Another part of it looks like it was more recently carved. So this is unusual in the Southeast. We don't get writing on stone much unless it's in caves. There's a good body of like cave art with inscriptions like this. But an upright stone like this with an inscription on it is pretty unusual. It's probably unique. So it's inspired a lot of debate about whether it was genuine, whether it was brought in, set up. I think I have no problem accepting this. It looks a lot like some of the southeastern cave art in a lot of respects. But you get a lot of different opinions about it.
Isn't there another one by the museum?
There's another one by the museum that might have a circle on it. And there, depending on who you talk to, there might be several others beyond that.
So any the maps that you were showing of the Crystal River developing, the big mound like opposite the plaza was kind of stretch out along the water. Was that for any particular reason?
I think you might just be thinking of the midden. I can
Okay,
hold
yeah,
up again.
yeah.
So the midden is, you know, in some places in Florida, it's a fine line between a midden and a mound, right? But this one is, it's, you know, it's about, like I said, about 6 feet tall. It's a ridge, basically, of shelled midden, of trash. Yeah.
Is there any particular reason for like the shape, or did it just kind of?
Well, I mentioned, I kind of think it references the burial mound. It kind of is oriented towards the burial mound. It's kind of like a C shape. But that kind of C shape is fairly typical for this time period, either a C or a complete circle. So,
Did you find any evidence that they utilized manatees?
no, that was that's something I thought about a lot. We have not found a single manatee bone. We haven't identified all the bone that we recovered, but I think we would have recognized a manatee. There's 1 or 2 possible manatee bones from Crystal River, but they're not from good context, so we can't even say whether they're modern or ancient. And to tell you the truth, there's not a lot of manatee bone from anywhere in Florida. But it does make you wonder, because manatees are so plentiful at Crystal River now, and presumably you could hunt those pretty easily. So I tend to think the manatee phenomenon at Crystal River is actually a modern phenomenon. I'm not saying that there weren't any before, but I think a lot of it started with the power plants that were built beginning in the 1920s with the coal-powered power plant, and now with the nuclear plant, that discharge of warm water has had a big...
Do you think they might have been a taboo against?
You know, that's possible. That is possible. But, you know, mostly Native Americans ate whatever they could get their hands on. So I tend to think they weren't anywhere near as plentiful as they are now. Again, yep.
Is there any evidence, I know the town is developed, but at the head of the river, is there any evidence of any village life?
There is, yeah, there several sites were recorded before all the development around downtown. One of which was a cemetery on one of the little islands around Kings Bay. The date, it looks like it dates like maybe just after Crystal River, or during the kind of later stages of Crystal River. But I assume there were more settlements around there. But no one's ever found like a manatee kill site, if you're drawing a connection. Yeah.
With the multiple mounds, were they just like, okay, this one's full, go to the next one, or did it have something to do with the social strata? If you're a leader, you go here.
We don't know. Why they would build one small mound and then build another small mound. 2 of those small platform mounds are almost instantaneous from our carbon dates. I mean, carbon dates, the resolution, you can't say that they were happening at the same time, but they were close in time. There was a bit of a little building frenzy there, and I'm not sure, what the motivation was exactly. That's a good question. Okay. Thanks again for having me. Thank you all for coming out.